Okay, thanks for coming to my AGU talk. I'm Dan Westervelt. I'm a research scientist at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory of Columbia University. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors listed below here. And what I'll be talking about is developing emulators of climate responses to regional aerosol perturbations using three coupled chemistry climate models. A little bit of motivation first. Models are showing that emissions of aerosols and their precursors are decreasing in recent decades and will continue to decrease in the future according to our best projections. And so these two plots here are showing at the top the SO2 emissions over time, and at the bottom the black carbon emissions over time from 1960 in the historical to 2100 with the future scenarios. And you can see that there's been a strong decreasing trend in the historical data since about 1980, and that's expected to continue in the different future scenarios. We're also starting to see this a little bit in the observational data. This is satellite retrievals from OMI showing that SO2 emissions are decreasing in China in recent years. So you can see the red line here with a sort of decreasing trend. The opposite is likely true in other parts of the world, such as India. We still see some increases, slow and steady increases in SO2 emissions here. But the changes in emissions are seeming to be mostly decreases owing to sort of air pollution and health concerns. And so the questions that I'm interested in and that I'll talk about today are what is the impact of these regional aerosol emission changes, which are mostly reductions, on future climate. And so in particular, going to focus on future temperature or just temperature in this presentation. And so I also am going to explore the robustness of our knowledge of these changes in temperatures in response to changing aerosol emissions. And then using that assessment of robustness to develop emulators of the temperature response to aerosol emissions. And to do this work, we use a multi-chemistry climate model framework. We use three fully coupled chemistry climate models, basically in their CMIP5 configuration. This is the GFDL CM3 model, the NCAR CESM1 model, and GIS E2. These are including both direct and indirect effects of aerosols. An exception is the GIS E2 version that we used here did not have a cloud lifetime effect. Our methodology is to first simulate a long control simulation of about 400 years, in which we just have year 2000 or year 2005 conditions perpetually repeating over and over again for 400 years. And we're going to compare that control simulation to a series of perturbation simulations in where we perturb the emissions of anthropogenic aerosols of a certain type and in a certain region. So for example, we can zero out the emissions of SO2 over the US, and other than that, the simulation is identical as the control, and we run this perturbation simulation for about 200 years, and then we have, with the control, a nice ability to take a difference and understand the impact of the removal of the SO2 emissions. We do this for a whole bunch of different regions. These are the regions that we have simulated, and so there's a total of 34 perturbation simulations across all models. For example, I mentioned the US SO2. We also do US BC, US organic carbon or OC, and US all anthropogenic together. So each of those are separate simulations. We also do similar simulations over Europe, China, India, and we also have some biomass burning simulations. But what I'll talk about mostly today are the responses to the SO2 emissions. So I'm going to show here just a quick look at the global mean, or the global annual mean temperature change due to SO2 removal. So what I'm showing here is the response and temperature defined as the perturbation minus the control. So it's the response to the removal of the SO2. And this first row is showing the temperature response in the three models due to the removal of US SO2 emissions, anthropogenic SO2. So you can see that there's a lot of statistical significance. That's what the hatching is indicating in each of the models. There's quite a bit of warming over most of the world, which makes sense, but also especially warming over the Arctic due to some Arctic amplification. We see that in all three models. We have a bit of a weaker response in the GISS E2 model in temperature, probably due to the lack of the cloud lifetime effect. For Europe SO2, we see something pretty similar in sort of a broad picture where we have lots of widespread warming with significance. There's also, again, a huge impact in the Arctic. And there's also, a larger change in temperature in sort of the local source region. So over Europe, where the SO2 emissions are removed, and over the Mediterranean and sort of North Africa, we see some changes there. And finally, I'll show here the China SO2 emission response. And here we see a slightly weaker temperature response to a removal of China SO2 emissions. But where the response is larger and significant is going to be over the polar regions, and especially the Arctic. So there's a statistically significant temperature increase both in remote regions to the emission source and in the local regions of that emission source. And sometimes the remote response is much, much greater than the local response. We can also assess, since we have these three models, how much agreement is there between these three models and how robust these responses are. And so what I've done here is plotted a figure in which the green color indicates that all three models agree on the sign of the temperature response, and all three models have statistical significance in that same region. The dark blue is similar. It's all three models agree on sign, but two of the three models agree on significance. And then the light blue is all three models agree on sign, but only one or none of the models agree on significance. So the yellow and the white are kind of where you don't have agreement. You only maybe have two models in agreement on sign. So everything kind of light blue and above and dark blue and green are where we think we have the most robustness. And you can see that the temperature response to US SO2 is fairly robust. The Europe SO2 one is as well. These percentages right above in the upper corner of the plot are the percentages of land area that are covered in this light blue color or above. So these are kind of the areas of robustness, and you can see that it's almost 81% in response to European SO2. You get down to some of these other simulations, for example, the black carbon removal in India, and the robustness percentage is much lower. It's less than 40%. So we're going to use these results to define a series of temperature emulators, regional temperature emulators. And what those are defined as is the change in temperature in a given region called I, normalized by the change in emissions in another region, J. And so these can be the same region, but they don't have to be. And so it's also for a given species, but we're mostly going to just look at SO2 for the rest of this talk. And we can use the model agreement in the previous figures to sort of help guide the application of these emulators. And so we saw the most robust response in the Arctic, in the northern hemispheric mid-latitudes, and in the tropics. We didn't see much robustness in the southern hemisphere, so we wouldn't necessarily want to apply these emulators to the southern hemisphere, or at least apply them with caution. We also saw the most robustness to a response to SO2 emissions, more so than with black carbon or organic carbon. So we're going to focus on the SO2. And we can develop here this dt I sub dej, this relationship between the climate response and the regional emissions change to diagnose climate responses using models that or data sets that only simulate emission changes. So you can get a sort of climate response without having to run a coupled Earth system model, without having to do all that computationally expensive simulation. That's sort of the benefit here. So here I'm showing the temperature emulators for the regional SO2 emission changes. So it's Europe SO2, US SO2, China SO2, and India SO2 in these 4 pods here. And the y-axis is the delta T, delta E. So the temperature change in a given region for a different emission change. And so the regions here that we're looking at, I'm starting off at the top with just the global. So it's not really a region, but the global temperature response per emission change in each of these subregions. So in Europe, SO2, in US, SO2, and so on and so forth. So globally, the values are kind of small, but the power of this is that you could take, for example, the multi-model mean here, and take this temperature emulator and multiply it times some predicted or simulated change in regional emissions over Europe, over the US, over China, over India, and get the temperature response from just having that emissions data. So this could be really powerful for integrated assessment modeling or impacts modeling or things like that. In the bottom panel is where we get into the regional stuff. So I was just talking about global, but this is the temperature emulator just for the 60 to 90 degree north latitude band. So all longitudes, but 60 to 90 degree north surface temperatures. And you can see that, the values here are about, 0.3 to 0.4, depending on which region you're looking at. So for every unit of emission change over the US or over Europe, you get about a 0.3 or 0.4 Kelvin temperature increase over the Arctic. The same thing can be done here now for the northern hemispheric mid-latitudes, which are this top panel C. And here the values are a little bit smaller, but still, about 0.01 or so. So 0.01 temperature change, Kelvin temperature change per unit emission change. And then we also do the tropics here as well. So you could generate kind of a regional, and right now it's sort of sub-global, just looking at the latitude bands, but you could go even further and get a lot of good information about temperature change without having to do all this complicated simulations and computationally expensive simulations. So just to do a little bit of a proof of concept of this, what we're going to do is compare the 1950s versus 1970s temperature in the CESM2 WACM 6 historical full chemistry ensemble, which has 12 ensemble members. And this model was run 12 different members from 1950 to 2014. And so the 1950s and 1970s were dominated, we expect, by sulfate aerosols. There was mostly cooling over the northern hemisphere land area. There was warming elsewhere. But we think we can use this as sort of a test of our emulators, since they are so dominated by the aerosols in that era. And so we can calculate the emulated temperature as the DT versus DE, where the delta emissions in the region are computed from the CMIP6 emissions for this newer model. And so when you do that, you get first here in panel A, this is just the temperature response, the change in temperature between 1970s and 1950s in that CESM2 WACM 6 historical full chemistry ensemble. And as you can expect, there is cooling over the land surface. There wasn't much global temperature increase during this period, maybe even a slight decrease. There's warming kind of elsewhere. Here are this is just in panel B, the temperature change over in response to US and Europe SO2 emissions. And then at the bottom here is the reconstructed temperature. I flipped the sign with using the emulators to sort of reconstruct the 1970s versus 1950s temperature change. And you can see that over the mid-latitudes, where you get this cooling, the change in temperature over the mid-latitudes for this area was about minus 0.18 Kelvin. Using the emulators to reconstruct that temperature, just having the emissions data in this region, you get about minus 0.23. So pretty good agreement. And so we say that emulators can accurately predict regional temperature response to aerosols as simulated by full chemistry large ensemble climate models. The big caveat is that obviously the aerosols aren't going to pick up the warming that happened in those regions that were probably due to CO2 or some other forcing. But for the aerosol specific effects that we expect to happen over the northern hemisphere mid latitudes, especially over the US and over Western Europe, these emulators work very well. So with that, I will leave my summary up here, and I look forward to seeing you at the question and answer session. Thanks.